Welcome, everyone. My name is Megan McKenzie, and I'm a professor of gender and war here in the Department of Government and International Relations. I want to start the evening with an acknowledgement of country. I'd like to acknowledge that this meeting is being held on Aboriginal land that wasn't sold or ceded. The University of Sydney is built on the ancestral lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I acknowledge the first Australians as the traditional custodians of the continent, whose cultures are among the oldest living cultures in human history. I pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and I also want to extend a special welcome to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who might be here today. So welcome. It's wonderful to see so many people here for this important topic. I encourage you to join the conversation from your seats if you're interested. You can tweet at Sydney Ideas or follow any of the Twitter handles of our speakers that are presented here. This event, as you can see, is being video recorded. It's also being audio recorded for podcast purposes. So before we begin, some thanks are necessary. I'd like to thank Sydney Ideas for their support in organizing this event, as well as our co-hosts, the Centre for International Security Studies. Thank you to the Faculty of Arts and the University of Sydney for the funding that made this event possible. Thank you to the research assistants who have helped on this project so far. Research assistants are often the unsung heroes of every academic event, and they make these events possible. So Edda Ganaiden, Jackie Dent, Caroline Yarnell, and Marilyn Concorger. Thank you especially to our panelists and moderator for coming across the world, interstate, and across the city to be here this evening. I'll introduce them in a minute. To start off with, I want to note that this is a sensitive topic. While this panel is focused on military suicide, suicide more generally is an issue that affects many of us deeply. I want to acknowledge that it's possible that some of us in this room have been directly impacted by suicide. I know I have. On the last slide, we'll be sharing some information about resources that are available if you or anyone you know needs them. And while we acknowledge the personal nature of this topic and the very real and broad impacts of military suicide, this evening is primarily focused on the research. I brought together a strong research perspective with a diverse range of scholars and a frontline worker, with the goal of informing policy and addressing ways to support service members and veterans. I also want to note that we've been advised by mental health professionals and advocates to try and move away from using the term committing suicide to death by suicide or completed suicide. So if you hear that language, and we'll work hard to do that, I think hearing the words committed suicide is a bit common, so we might not always get it right, but we're working to make that shift, and we encourage you to think about that as well. So this talk is funded by the Multidisciplinary Arts and Social Sciences Inaugural Fellowship, and I was a recipient last year. The goal of this fellowship is to promote interdisciplinary collaboration between scholars within the Faculty of Arts and one of the multidisciplinary initiatives. So one of my first goals with this fellowship was to initiate an interdisciplinary conversation about this issue, bringing together scholars from different fields of study. Tonight, we're doing just that. I brought together experts in clinical psychology, medical anthropology, sociology, and media together to share their expertise on this important issue. In terms of format, I'm going to introduce the speakers. I will start the evening by talking a little bit about my own research. Each of the panelists will speak for a few minutes. There'll be a moderated discussion, followed by opening up to the audience for a question and answer. So first on my right is Ben Wadham. Ben's a sociologist and criminologist from Flinders University and also served in the Australian Regular Army. One of the reasons I was really excited to bring him here, he does fantastic work on military culture, and he also has this great perspective as someone who's served in the Army and also has studied the military for a number of years. Next, we have Kenneth McLeish, who is an assistant professor of medicine, health, and society and anthropology at Vanderbilt University. He's a cultural anthropologist. His book, Making War at Fort Hood, Life and Uncertainty in a Military Community was one of the most exciting books I've read in the last 5 years. His work in terms of doing ethnographic study with military communities really, I think, re-examines the way that war impacts the everyday lives of service members, families, and communities. Next, we have Shane Greentree, who's a clinical psychologist and the National Psychology Services Director at Soldier On. To me, it was really important to have a clinical psychologist here, but it's even more important that I have somebody who works directly with service members and veterans. So I'm very grateful that Shane's here. Our moderator, Jackie Dent, is a widely published journalist, international communication specialist, and PhD student. It's wonderful that she can moderate this event, not only because of her media experience, but also because of her experience working in war zones, including Afghanistan. So welcome again to this Sydney Ideas event entitled Why Are Soldiers Taking Their Own Lives? As I said earlier, I'm a professor of gender and war here at the University of Sydney. I aspire to do research that will reduce and end wars. I do this by asking different questions about war and its long-term aftermaths. I'm especially curious about gender and war and the potentially different ways that men and women experience, participate in, and resist war. So before getting into some of the current research, it's worth noting the rather unique history of military suicide. In 1949, a clinical psychologist named Edwin Schneidem was working at a veterans hospital in Los Angeles. A young veteran had killed himself, and his suicide note was at the coroner's office. While there, Schneidem came across hundreds of other notes. His analysis of those notes and subsequent career in suicide has led him to be seen as the father of what is now known as modern suicidology. So this tells us that the study of military suicide has a short history. What we do know is that there has been increased attention to military suicide and a growing body of organizations working with service members and veterans to help address this issue. So although there's been increased attention, in many domestic contexts, there are very few international comparative studies of military suicide. And I think that's a problem. As a scholar of international relations, I think we need to have a sense of the rates of military suicide around the world, or at least across a strong case selection of countries. We need to understand trends over time and the variation in how particular countries address military suicide. Without this type of data, it's difficult to identify any particular countries that are getting it right and have managed to reduce military suicide, places where suicide is relatively low, or how Australia's rates of suicide compare to other similar sized militaries. So I've been working with researchers to try and create the first ever international database on military suicides. This would include the rates as well as policy responses from countries around the world. And what we found almost immediately is that there are several gaps in the data that's available, as well as obstacles to doing this kind of work. But these gaps or these obstacles are actually politically interesting in and of themselves and worth noting. So one of the first challenges is that actually the way that different countries define military suicide vary greatly. So some countries use the World Health Organization definition, but most countries have their own definition. Some national governments also have different definitions of military suicide compared to their militaries. Some militaries have different definitions amongst the services. So the Army, Navy, and Air Force might have different definitions, which makes it very difficult to do cross-national comparisons. A second challenge is that there are a number of countries that don't collect and publish regular data on military suicide. There's also a gender component to the data collection. Because most national militaries have a minority number of women, some either don't publish the rates of female service member suicide at all, in which case you can't compare the rates of one country, which includes men and women, versus another country, which only includes men. It also means we don't have great data on how women are doing within militaries. And that's a significant problem, because we have lots of evidence to suggest that women might be particularly vulnerable to suicide. They're overrepresented in suicide attempts in Australia and other countries. And there's data within the United States to show that they're 250% more likely to commit suicide in that country. So despite these challenges, we've managed to collect some data, and the results, I think, are significant. So a snapshot of what we do know, just this previous year, 2017, more Australian military personnel and veterans took their lives than were killed in Afghanistan during 13 years of war. In Canada, members of the Army are 50% more likely to kill themselves as compared to civilian Canadians. In the US, military suicide is often talked about as an epidemic. Suicide rates for service members have risen dramatically since 2001 and doubled in 2012. Research in Australia and the US has also shown that male veterans are nearly twice as likely to commit suicide than their civilian counterparts. Again, there's little data about female veterans in Australia, but we do know that they have some particular vulnerabilities. So it's just a couple of visuals to help you see where Australia sits within the global context or some of its closest allies. You can see the dark blue is male military suicide rate, and you can see that the male suicide rate is actually lower than the general population, which is the light blue. So historically, being in the military has been a protective factor for suicide. What's kind of perplexing to researchers is why veterans have such high rates of suicide. So here you have some data on the US to show how actually both in military populations as well as civilian populations, you have a dramatic increase in suicide rates overall over a long period of time. So here's the increased rates in suicide. And this final one, I think, captures what I see as one of the most challenging pieces of data to show the baseline rates for Australia and US in terms of suicide rates in the general population. And then you see in the green is veteran suicide rates between 18 years of age and 29, and orange is Australia, which is quite a significant increase over a period of time. So another goal of this research was really to explore what I've seen as the vast gap between the rhetoric on military suicide and what we know from available research. In short, the stories we tell about military suicide are often not based on fact. In particular, one of the most dominant stories told about military suicide is that soldiers are at an increased risk of death by suicide if they've been exposed to trauma while serving in combat operations. So the consistent narrative is that when healthy soldiers deploy to combat zones, they experience trauma and are vulnerable to PTSD and are more likely to die by suicide as a result. So to be sure, there are certainly combat soldiers who may have that experience, be deployed, experience trauma, and are vulnerable. However, research shows that this dominant combat narrative doesn't capture the complete picture when it comes to military suicide. The presumed connection between combat, PTSD, and military suicide is understandable, given that combat roles have historically been understood as some of the most dangerous, violent, and important military jobs. Media coverage of military suicide often reinforces this link. We did a media analysis of the past 2 years of media coverage around military suicide, and nearly half of the articles mention combat. So although military suicide is consistently associated with combat exposure, this link isn't supported by available research. So research shows no strong link between serving in combat operations and increased vulnerability to military suicide. In fact, available medical data indicates that service members who have never even deployed, let alone experienced combat, may be among the most vulnerable. So again, that doesn't mean that service members who have served in combat aren't vulnerable. What it means is that they're not the only or the most vulnerable community. A study that followed Australian and Vietnam veterans over 20 years found no significant increase in the service members who deployed versus those who stayed home. What's perhaps most fascinating about that study is that the children of both sets of service members were 3 times more likely to commit suicide. So this research tells us that the issue of military suicide is complex and can't simply be explained only as a product of combat exposure. Medical research also complicates this common link between PTSD and military suicide. Several researchers have found that service members who have PTSD may actually be less likely to suicide. This may be because they have sought diagnosis or have a care plan. So this research, I think, goes against some of our most deeply held assumptions about war and suicide. It also goes against common popular cultural depictions of war, where it's the combat soldiers who are most likely to be harmed, both physically and mentally. I think exploring the complexity around military suicide matters because responses to military suicide should be based on facts, not misrepresentations or stereotypes. The misperception that military suicide stems from combat exposure could lead to ineffective policy responses and less attention and resources to service members who haven't experienced combat. For example, several studies indicate that it's young men who have never deployed and have recently left the service who are most at risk. Other factors include addictions, pre-existing mental health issues, social isolation, and access to firearms. So what accounts for this vast gap between the rhetoric and the available data? I think there are two explanations. First, linking military suicide to combat exposure draws on our common perceptions of combat that I spoke about earlier. So even though warfare has changed dramatically over the past few decades, we often still treat combat roles as the most dangerous and exposed. But wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have been counterinsurgency wars that don't have clear front lines. That means that service members who may be in support roles, including medics, could be just as likely to be exposed to violence. It may seem more natural for the public to accept that service members' experiences in war overseas, sort of out there, is their greatest risk factor for suicide, instead of facing the possibility that there may be something about serving in general or serving here at home that makes soldiers more vulnerable. It may also be more comfortable than facing research that points to a range of complex issues that might contribute to military suicide. So I think what's required is a shift in our thinking about military suicide. I think we need to bring military suicide home, if you will. This shift in thinking can produce different responses to military suicide. So instead of considering military suicide as an inevitable byproduct of combat exposure, we might focus on the impacts of military service on service members themselves, look at internal military culture, and re-examine the resources and support service members are given when they leave their jobs. So the second reason for this gap is I think this complexity requires collaboration and partnership and information sharing between scholars working in different fields of study, including medicine, anthropology, military studies, politics and international relations, and clinical psychology, to name a few. Historically, there has not always been effective collaboration and conversation between these fields of study. I think this kind of collaboration can help us find better answers to complex questions and to understand surprising and confronting research findings. And that's what we're here to do today, to generate an interdisciplinary conversation. When I imagined this event, I couldn't think of, this is exactly my dream panel who I was hoping to have here, so I'm so thrilled to pass on to our next speaker, Ben Wadham.
Hello, everybody. Thanks, Megan. It's an exciting event to be talking at, and it's always exciting to talk about your own research. A little bit about me. As Megan said, I did serve in the Australian Defence Force a few decades ago, 5 years of service, Royal Australian Infantry, and then I was a military investigator. And it's through being a military investigator that I probably developed some of the interests now that I research. My research focuses on military culture. So some of those things that Megan talked about there, I'm going to be talking about military suicide, not in terms of the combatant, but in terms of the way the military system works, the way in which, say, the Department of Veterans Affairs deals with veterans, or the way the Department of Defence deals with soldiers that their mental health or also when they're leaving. So it's more of an internal type of analysis. As a sociologist or criminologist, I'm interested in systems. I'm interested in a lot of other things too, but in the case of what I'm going to talk about today, I'm interested in the systems in which defence people find themselves, in which veterans find themselves. There's a lot of work going on in that area at the moment. The ADF, over the last probably 6 or 7 years, has been involved in around about 10 inquiries looking at veteran transition, looking at institutional abuse in the Australian Defence Force, looking at veteran legislation, and a range of other things in terms of transition as well. So they're the two kind of issues I'm going to be talking about. As I said, they're sort of internal system issues. And one is question of transition can lead or sit behind military suicide, but also the issue of institutional abuse. So to start off with, I want to go back to actually saying that the question of transition is a massive challenge for, I think, for all veterans. It's a highly transformative sort of process to go from being a civilian to becoming a soldier. When we join the military, we become militarised. And that's a profound change into one's way of being in the world, to our reasons for getting up in the morning, our dispositions to others, and our sense of who we are. For many young Australians, it is the pinnacle of their life so far to join and serve in the Australian military. So when it comes time for military personnel, for veterans to separate from the military, this is also a massively profound change. And I can say that several decades on, I feel like I'm still transitioning. I don't know what that's like for every veteran, but certainly it's, I guess, being part of the veteran community, you know, there's still a strong sense of identity and belonging there. So military personnel are made from the raw material of the civilian. So when one becomes a soldier, one can never erase that experience. You can't go back to being a civilian. Veteran transition has to be understood from the point where one is trained to become part of the military, not always at the back end of leaving the military. I want to explain that process of change because it is so profound. So I'll draw on military historian Darren Moore. And Darren Moore says that as part of this initial basic training that every military person goes through, the objective is to purge the recruit's civil identity, including any preconceptions he or she may hold about his or her rights and personal freedoms, and supplant the civilian value system with that of the military. This is accomplished by various methods, including denigrating those outside the military system and at the same time stressing the virtues of the military community. It is in effect a transformational approach where the recruit self-actualises the desire to become part of the military. Other approaches are more individualised, relying on humiliation and brutality to break an individual's self-esteem, lower their resistance to the values and attitudes that the military wants them to adopt, and reinforce the omnipotent nature of military discipline. Becoming military involves a separation of the recruit from their past. Okay, so we leave our civilian surroundings to go to our basic training, wherever that is, and whether we're a commissioned or non-commissioned officer. There's a separation that happens and a substitution. We move from the family and friends and community as our initial identity to the military family. And, you know, that's a massive thing that you'll hear many veterans talk about, the camaraderie, the mateship, the belonging. And it's something which is intense when you leave the military and you leave that behind. So transitioning is much more than just a psychological statal process. It's a cultural practice and a social phenomenon. It's one of the key points I want to leave you with, is that it's not just an individual matter, it is cultural, it is systemic. It is about how the state and the military and civil society conceives of veterans, how our society thinks about military personnel, and how veterans see themselves among those forces and how they learn to navigate those new roles and obligations. And while many make a smooth transition out of the military, many don't. They go on to experience difficulties in employment and education, health, social problems, and relationship issues. Now, according to the Constant Battle Report, around 118 veterans have committed suicide since September 2016. And kind of relating to Megan's discussion about data, the inquiry acknowledges that this may not reflect the exact number of suicides due to limited data. In fact, the numbers that the veteran community suggests in terms of PTSD and mental health issues seems to be larger than the state want to recognise. So let me just tell you an example of how the question of transition and having to negotiate a new complex system can have an effect upon a veteran. I'll tell you the story of Jesse Bird, who served in the ADF from 2007 to 2010. He was deployed to Afghanistan on several occasions. On return from deployment, Jesse struggled with his experiences and sought help from the DVA. Early in 2017, his mother and father submitted to the Senate inquiry the constant battle into suicide by veterans, and they explain his situation. He's been endeavouring to seek assistance from DVA for the last 18 months without success. It seems to him and us that the level of bureaucracy is intentionally obstructionist and unedifying. The jungle of paperwork, the lack of follow-up and the non-existent support has contributed to his deteriorating mental health. He is involved with VVCS and is undergoing programs. Jesse has not received any money whatsoever from DVA or Centrelink to help him survive, and without our financial and emotional help, he would be on the street or worse. Jesse took his life during the inquiry in 2017, and his father commented at the time, "The department is charged with the responsibility to care and support our veteran community, and that is what the Australian community expects to happen, not the current delay, deny, destroy." So it's a story of a young man who joined the ADF as a profession, who loved his job but struggled with the consequences. His story is one of the soldier and the state, and how after signing on the dotted line and volunteering to make the ultimate sacrifice, he was denied welfare, recognition and support for the consequences of his service. So submissions to the constant battle, that particular inquiry I'm talking about, outlined mental health issues, PTSD, homelessness, poverty, unemployment, poor job security, family violence, social isolation, perceived maladministration in the military justice system, substance abuse and experience of sexual assault and bullying as key issues experienced by veterans. It's quite a list. These submissions also outline significant frustration with the state-governed veteran sector, arguing that excessive bureaucracy, institutional denial and malfeasance sometimes characterised dealing with DVA. So that's a discussion about a complex system which veterans have to negotiate when they leave the military, and one which can generate great confusion and feel like a complete lack of support. Now, the other issue I said I'd talk about is abuse, which has been a significant issue in the Australian Defence Force, particularly since 2011. It has a much longer history, but the first review there, the DLA Piper Review into Sexual, Physical and Other Abuse in the ADF, was released in about 2012. Since then, around 3,000 cases have come to light, but we accept that that's probably the tip of the iceberg. So let me just cover a couple of cases to talk about the suicide of some young private soldiers in the Australian Defence Force. This is not representative, but it just shows an example of the way in which defence culture can work to undermine the security and safety of its people. Private Jeremy Williams was a high flyer. He loved the army. He excelled at Kapooka and was committed to the infantry. It was everything to him. And during training, Jeremy suffered shin splints, which isn't an uncommon complaint when you're walking large distances with heavy packs, water and weapons. Jeremy was replaced in recuperation and discharge platoon. Leading up to his death, there had been numerous inquiries and reports into the School of Infantry and bullying and harassment. There was the Burchett report and the investigation into the abusive treatment of another Private Amos at the School of Infantry. It was still fresh. Allegations were raised in early 2003 that recuperation and discharge platoon soldiers at Singleton were being subjected to abuse, denigration, harassment, bullying, including threats of physical violence by staff and other trainees. Plus the absence of efficient and effective support services or mechanisms where the soldiers could report the abuse or complain. Jeremy told his family how he was made to feel worthless, useless, scum and shameful because he was injured and had been transferred to R&D platoon. Although this is an inquiry about a particular set of practices around the early 2000s, I can say that certainly I experienced that 10 or 15 years earlier in the same place. So it seems to me to be part of an ongoing culture in the military, one which is admittedly being looked at over the last sort of 10 years or so. The executive summary, just moving to wind up, explained this. Explained that he found a widespread use of negative reinforcement to motivate recruits under training. This includes disparaging and negative comments about these platoons. Okay, so in my day, these was called the sick, lame and lazy platoons. There is also a perception that many of those in those platoons are weak, and as a consequence, all members of the platoon are subjected to widespread denigration. On April 14, 2003, gunner John Satatis also committed suicide at A Battery 4 Field Regiment, Holsworthy. He too had recently completed his IET training. He too had been injured during that period and in the sick, lame and lazy platoon. So these are just a couple of cases, but abuse in defence is a long-standing issue and it affects all military personnel from recruits all the way up to even two-star generals. I'm currently the lead investigator on a national study into institutional abuse funded by the Australian Research Council. The effect of institutional abuse has profound effects upon people and does culminate in suicide. So just finishing off, as a nation and a government, we spend much time and resources preparing and training young military personnel, but we don't spend the same effort and dedication when they leave. The series of government inquiries is hopefully working towards better responses, but victims of abuse have also been heard through various inquiries, the DLA Piper Review. I guess the point for me is that military culture, because of the closed nature of the institution and the close working relationships of personnel within a hierarchical command and control system, harbours great potential for abuse. The government and the military are working towards better systems of assessment, yet the tendency remains to see veteran suicide as an individual response. Veteran suicide is not just an individual response, it's also a cultural dilemma. Thanks.
Good evening, everyone. I also would like to convey my thanks to Megan McKenzie and to University of Sydney and Sydney Ideas. It's a tremendous pleasure and privilege to get to be here and be part of this conversation this evening. So, like Megan mentioned a moment ago, my name is Ken McLeish. I'm a cultural anthropologist, and my research looks at the ways that people make meaning out of war experience. I look at the ways that lives are shaped by military institutions and what values and assumptions are wrapped up in those relationships. This is something that, especially coming from the US, is especially important to me because of the ways that in the US, the military is a uniquely trusted and valorized institution, but it's one that most of the American population does not have any direct association with in the number of decades since the US switched to an all-volunteer force. And as a country, our familiarity and association with the military is chiefly through stereotype and imagery in popular media. And it's really important to me in my work that the people in whose name war is done, whether it's in the US or Australia or elsewhere in the world, that the people in whose name war is done have as complete as possible of an understanding of what war actually consists of, so that it's possible to have an ethical and responsible relationship to it and its effects. And it's also something that's important to me in terms of helping Americans understand the distinctiveness of our uniquely militarized country in the US and to help make sense of the outsized role that the US plays in global war making. Now, as an anthropologist, and very much, but also very much in keeping with the two folks who spoke before me, it's my professional position that the stories that we tell about war matter profoundly, and in some ways, specifically because of that disconnect, because stories are part of how we as a society know war. And I would even go so far as to say that those narratives and those stories are a fundamental part of what war is, that are kind of grafted onto the actual activities of making and producing it. And my main point this evening, and my remarks now, is simply that the profound importance of stories. That when it comes to military suicide, when it comes to the act itself, when it comes to the things that we say about it, and when it comes to the ways that institutions respond to it, that all of these things direct our attention to some aspects of war, but also distract our attention from other aspects of it. And this is the way in which stories matter so significantly, so profoundly. So this is a position that I've come to through over 10 years of conducting research on a number of war-related topics, looking at the language of military policy and discourse on war-related mental illness, looking at representations of war and the military and veterans in U.S. Popular culture, but also, and most importantly to me, spending a lot of time conducting ethnographic research and getting to know war veterans, soldiers, and other service members, military families, military care providers, and advocates and caretakers and clinicians. And across this work, and especially in the ethnographic component, in the time that I spend with veterans and military families, talk about and experience of suicide is ubiquitous. For instance, during the research that I conducted at the U.S. Army's Fort Hood in Central Texas, one of the biggest military installations in the world, and I was there during the height of the U.S. war in Iraq in 2007 and 2008. And this was incidentally a time when the U.S. military suicide rate was climbing, but it was still lower than the civilian suicide rate. It had not yet reached the rather dramatic and concerning heights that Megan McKenzie alluded to a moment ago. But that even in this context, the base averaged about 2 suicides per month, and nearly everybody I knew and spent time with knew people who had struggled with self-harm, who had taken their own lives, or who had in other ways been affected by suicide. In the research I've been conducting more recently with recently transitioning post-9/11 veterans across the U.S. Southeast, suicide experiences, worries about people harming themselves, and statistical ideas about the prevalence of suicide are likewise things that are perpetually invoked in a number of different settings oriented toward providing care for recent and transitioning veterans that research has taken me to. And the thing that I want to share about these stories is that in the way that people talk about this phenomenon in these settings, in everyday life, in military and veteran communities, the death itself, the suicides themselves, matter tremendously in their own right. But they also are incredibly important to people in the way these stories are told, because of the way that they point to so many other problems that come from the routine functions of military institutions and American war-making. And this includes things like long and repeated deployments. So for folks in the U.S. Army, these are deployments of 12 to 15 months, often with as little as 12 months spent at home between deployments. It includes things like the military's tremendous reach into without even getting into the question of abuse, soldiers' everyday lives and conduct and kind of control over their own bodies and well-being. And it includes, of course, the toll that deployments take on family and intimate relationships, and on the perceived indifference of the military and of the Veterans Health Administration, or the VA, in the U.S. And so all of that is to say that the way that folks talked about these deaths, they pointed not so much to the horrors of the battlefield or to particular instances or experiences of violence, but rather to an entire system that, by its very nature, by fact of what it's designed to do, deliberately exposes soldiers to harm on a routine and regular and large-scale basis, and then in the aftermath of that harm, from the perspective of how these folks talk about suicide, fails to care for them. And this is a system, again, that I want to emphasize is driven by macro-level policy decisions about how to wage war and how to exercise military force. Now, a kind of additional painful irony that was frequently associated with these stories is that military responses to the perceived risk of suicide or to behaviors that were regarded as self-harming frequently seemed to soldiers and their loved ones and care providers and advocates to be focused more on controlling or even punishing soldiers who appeared to be at risk rather than helping or supporting them. And I could tell a bunch of stories about this, but to keep it brief, jokes or exasperated or sarcastic remarks about suicide or self-harm, minor instances like failing to show up for formation or things like that, these were things that could be met with what soldiers themselves experienced as severe official overreaction, even to the point of sort of being punitive. At the same time as folks in these situations were also well aware of many instances in which people seeking help were not able to get it, or in which they even found themselves targeted for removal, for separation from the ranks, and thereby separation from what medical and psychiatric support they would have had access to in a military setting. And so all of this is just to say that a frequent theme that runs through these stories also is that caring for suicidal soldiers in a disciplinary institution like the military often comes to look simply like controlling them or making them into a problem that is no longer the Army's or the military's responsibility. And I'll conclude just by remarking on the fact that a similar dynamic also exists in the broader American culture, in the kind of broader civilian and lay discourse that exists around military and also veteran suicide in the U.S. In the U.S., this particular topic has become a sort of catch-all or proxy for talking about a huge range of different challenges that anyone who is familiar with veterans' issues knows that, and again, Ben alluded to this a moment ago, knows that many veterans may find themselves struggling with at one point or another, whether it has to do with strained relationships or actual psychological challenges or difficulty adjustment or what have you, that a kind of an urgent attention to suicide in the U.S. has come to make it serve as a kind of reductive proxy for this vast range of different concerns. And suicide is undoubtedly a tremendously important and urgent issue. But a thing I want to emphasize here is that certain ways of talking about it seem to suggest or seem to have the effect that this broader host of issues only matters to the extent that soldiers and veterans stay alive, not to the extent that those lives are healthy and flourishing. I'll leave you all with the words of a Veterans Health Administration social worker who I know from my research, who, when we were talking about this topic a couple of years ago, remarked to me that to the extent that suicide intervention, when it happens on an individual basis, is an acute and crisis-driven and short-lived task, it is actually relatively easy to do. It's relatively easy to, when this opportunity and circumstances present themselves, to interrupt in the immediate circumstances of an individual suicide crisis. This is, again, the perspective of an experienced clinician saying this. But what he said to me was that, quote, it's all the other stuff that's really hard. Everything else that brought that person to that point everything else that is still going to be waiting for them in the wake of a crisis, everything that will still be there, all of these structural features and enduring factors that will still be there to afflict other people, even as this, as one or another individual case sort of moves along. And just to return to my sort of opening assertion about the importance of story, the importance of the stories we tell about war, I would argue that we need stories that do not leave these hard parts, the stuff that my friend was saying, that is the stuff that's really hard. We need stories that do not leave these hard parts out and that oblige us to reckon with them. And I'll conclude there for now. Thank you.
Hi everyone, and again thank you to Megan for organising the panel and to the other panel members. So my name's Shane Greentree. I am the National Psychology Services Director at Soldier On. For those, I'll just touch briefly on what Soldier is and what we do, Soldier On is as an organisation and what we aim to do. And I will just preface this as this is from our clinical experience and what we see in people that we work with as an organisation. So it may be a little different. So Soldier On's an organisation that started in 2012 and currently provides a range of services to contemporary veterans and their families in 9 locations around Australia. Connection is really at the core of what we do, and this ranges from organising coffee catch-ups in the community, family weekends away. We have sports recovery programs, a dedicated education and employment service, and also our clinical counselling services. We attempt to provide entry points along the spectrum of people's needs to act as from prevention and early intervention through to our more acute services. So Soldier On's mission is to work side by side with those who serve and protect Australia, their families, by helping them to secure their future. Obviously, within that mission, we want to address and help prevent veteran suicide. Within our psychology services nationally, we see a range of presentations and have a mix of men and women from all 3 services from within the ADF, and that includes both current and former serving. Trauma-related presentations would be the most common that we work with, but we also see comorbid depression, anxiety, substance misuse issues. We do work with people who may be experiencing chronic suicidal ideation, and whilst working with the individual, we also work with their family and treating team and community as part of that intervention and safety planning when possible. So in order to address the question put to the panel this evening, I thought it would actually be helpful from the clinical experience to think about or talk about the things that people tell us that help actually keep them alive and keep them safe. So when conducting fairly routine risk assessments, most commonly things such as family, and that includes military family, community, spirituality and religion, and having a sense of belonging and purpose. These are the things that people tell us and rate as being important as to what helps keep them alive. And across these factors, we really see connection as being a common theme. So it's definitely something that we consider in treatment and safety planning, and finding ways to help connect and people to connect and find purpose. So our interventions are not solely focused on diagnosis and symptom reduction, although those things are important. We need to take a holistic approach that encompasses multiple aspects of the person's life. We do so in taking a developmental perspective, considering pre and post-service as well as their service-related experiences. Looking across the lifespan. Often people will come into our treatment service having had traumatic experiences, or they may also already come with a diagnosis of PTSD, but consistent with what others have said, this isn't necessarily or even often related to combat or operation. We see people with a diagnosis of PTSD as a result of a number of potentially traumatic experiences or events that can span across their lifespan and being service and non-service related. Another component that we're beginning to understand more really is moral injury, and this is an idea that Moral injury occurs when one experiences an act, either through witnessing or participating in, that conflicts with or violates a core moral value or deeply held belief. This is commonly associated with deep feelings of guilt and shame, and standard PTSD interventions or clinical interventions generally have only really started to consider this concept in terms of treatment. Moral injury may impact a person's worldview and contribute to their struggles connecting with their family and community more broadly, and have a sense of not fitting in or having their ideas of right and wrong challenged so deeply that can lead to a sense of isolation. And we focus significantly on the transition process as well, and see that this is clearly a high-risk period for people. What we see as having an impact on people's functioning and what they tell us, particularly those being involuntarily discharged, this is a major upheaval and period of adjustment, and they will likely be discharging from the service with physical and psychological injuries, and at the same time losing many of the things that previously have been protective, their sense of connection and purpose. Many talk about their time in the military as having had a ready-made family, and transitioning out, for some, may be experienced as a major loss or even a sense of abandonment. Some feel like they have been thrown on the scrap heap and that their service has been for nothing. They're then faced with reintegrating into civilian life, not by choice, and may need to relocate and struggle finding employment and purpose. So, as already discussed by others, a number of risk factors that are known within the literature, but what do we see in practice? So thankfully being in treatment and connected to supports are seen as protective factors, and suicide is relatively a rare event for the people that are accessing our services. And so when we think of risk assessment, there are problems identified with the way that we classify risk from low to high and the way that we respond. It's been shown not to be much value in being predictive of those who will end up completing suicide. So one of the things that we want to look at is what is getting in the way of people accessing the services and help that they need to keep safe. So access to evidence-based practices that are offered by appropriately trained professionals that understand the military context and veteran experience is limited. Particularly in Australia, with its vast geography, this becomes a challenge. Of those transitioning out of military service that are likely meeting a mental health condition, only 25% of those end up accessing evidence-based care. There's also evidence of high dropout rates for treatment from the treatment protocols for veterans in Australia and also internationally as well. So we need to look at access and acceptability of interventions. A couple of other points that stigma regarding mental health is something that the whole community deals with. However, when we consider the veteran experience, this seems to be amplified. It's commonly reported that concerns about impact on career, fear of persecution, and not wanting to look weak affect people's willingness to seek help. The response to risk by military can be seen as overly restrictive and at times inconsistent with international best practice standards. And military members report to us seeing this being punitive rather than being supportive. And numerous examples of members being asked repeatedly about suicide risk when it doesn't seem evident, but it's become policy. And organisational culture, so being tough and needing to suck it up might be helpful and necessary in an operational context, but then unhelpful terms of accessing timely support when people are no longer in those environments. We hear evidence of bullying, harassment, or people coming forward but being dismissed or not feeling heard, and people then also witnessing that, reducing the likelihood of people coming forward in the future. One other aspect I want to touch on that's not often discussed, and I think this comes within the point of accessing support and what are the barriers, is this idea of the warrior or hero narrative that permeates the community and puts servicemen and women in a position of being somewhat superhuman. I think we really need to consider how we honour our servicemen and women and the language we use, which is absolutely important. But the stories that we hear is that there's a very large gap between this idea of being a hero and feeling worthless and having your world crumble around you, and that getting in the way of how can I come forward and acknowledge this when I'm a hero or a warrior. So just being mindful about how we honour those that serve and protect is something that I think we need to have as part of that conversation. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Jackie Dent. I'll be moderating a brief discussion this evening. A common theme that came up on the panel was the issue of military culture. And if you read, there's been a number of reports done in the United States about the issue of military suicide, as well as here in Australia. There's been Senate inquiries, a number of recommendations, and a common theme that comes out in these reports is that we need to change the military culture. Ben, I'd be interested in your sort of take on this with the ADF because, you know, militaries have to be tough. And, you know, how can someone, most of us in our workplaces, you know, there's so much stigma around having a mental illness. You know, I would never go forward at work and say I've got some, you know, mental problem. Like, how do people do it in the military? How can you change the culture where people can go forward and say they're struggling?
Yeah, I think there's it's almost intractable at some level, and I don't have a magic idea about how to fix that. But I think we have to recognise that the military is a very closed institution. It's command and control. It's very hierarchical. It's regimented, and that is for the purpose of adhering to the chain of command and passage of information and maintaining unit cohesion, those sorts of things. You know, all that sort of military talk. For some reason, over time, over history, people in the military have associated that with punitive kind of responses to training, punitive responses to people speaking up. So we see this in all these reports, you know, that the institution doesn't make it easy for people to report things. When people do report things, they're often pilloried or rejected. So I think the question for me is, to what extent do we? It does sit around that question of it's a hard job and that people have to have some level of resilience and ability to be able to operate in those kind of conditions. But the question is, do we need those sort of traditional type of hazing, bastardisation, fagging kind of activities which tend to result in abuse, which do result in abuse? And do we need to, and certainly the military justice, the Senate inquiry into the effectiveness of the military justice system back in 2005 said this, that we have to find ways of improving people's redress of grievance. I think there's one overarching thing that comes out of those inquiries to me, and it's a question of independent scrutiny. The military is a closed institution. It tends to run things in-house, and that means that it doesn't always have what we call maybe a negative feedback loop, a way of critiquing itself. So there are ways of doing that, and one suggestion is something called the ADF Administrative Review Board, which would be redress of grievance outside of the chain of command. That may be one way of breaking that kind of in-house sort of culture.
Megan, you've studied, obviously, you're a professor of gender and war. I mean, how does masculinity culture impact on women's service women and their problems that they have in the military?
Yeah, I think women have some particular vulnerabilities. So one of the issues that I missed in my talk because I was feeling a bit nervous is military sexual trauma, which is a major issue both in the Australian Defence Forces and in the US military, many militaries actually. Women who serve are very likely to experience military sexual trauma, including from assaults from fellow service members. We know that those women who experience military sexual trauma are very likely to also experience PTSD and other health-related issues. So they're vulnerable in that sense, and they're also vulnerable in the sense that they are already discriminated against. So women who are in the Defense Forces or in the US military already feel like they have to prove themselves to prove that they're tough. So that may mean they're less likely to come forward if they're struggling with a particular issue. So you kind of have those two different factors, I think, that affect women in particular.
I mean, another theme that came up in the talks, I thought, was this idea of the stories that we tell about war. And I think, Ken, with your work, you've made some interesting observations about PTSD. We have a perception now that any person that goes to war comes back with PTSD. It's like a blanket assessment. It's, you know, whenever we read a story about a soldier, it's always like PTSD. Is that a problem? I mean, do we need to sort of change this narrative about war?
So PTSD is interesting as a psychiatric diagnosis because its very existence as a diagnostic label is tied up with war and veterans. It came into existence as an official clinical diagnosis driven by a number of different factors through the 60s and 70s in the United States. But one of those major factors was a whole series of kinds of distress that U.S. veterans of the U.S. war in Vietnam were experiencing, but not able to get treatment or disability compensation for from the military or Veterans Health Administration. And it was thanks in part to those veterans and their clinician advocates that we have PTSD as a generic and inclusive psychiatric diagnosis in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders and the International Classification of Diseases. If we think about this, the fact that it's a psychiatric diagnosis, that's a clinical label. Like, its point is to identify the underlying pathology associated with a set of symptoms and to point to a course of treatment that is likely to work for an individual. It is completely insufficient as a kind of cultural and societal explanation for what kinds of things a person undergoes through the more general experience of being enmeshed in a military institution, participating in war violence, and dealing with the challenges of either return from deployment or a separation from service. It's not to say that they're separate from one another, but that one category, this very narrow clinical category on its own, is asked to do a lot of sort of bigger cultural work. In a society in which mental illness is so strongly associated with stigma and placed into these narratives of kind of threat to others and threat to social order, it's absolutely a problem because it muddies the picture of what veterans' actual mental health needs and challenges might be, but it also takes something that is a clinical category and uses it to talk about a vast array of social and cultural and interpersonal phenomena.
Ken, you know, in previous conflicts, PTSD has been known as shell shock, or other names like neurasthenia. I think it's been traced back to childhood development things or family issues. You know, really marked by a sort of resistance by the state to look after the soldiers, you would think. Why do you think it's become so widely used now and so accepted? It's got a very different status after these conflicts than after Vietnam.
Sure, yeah. Well, so one way of answering that question is to look at the kinds of social and political work that the diagnosis does. And so actually a couple of anthropologists who are also psychiatrists, Didier Fassin and Richard Rechtman, have advanced an argument that I find compelling and useful to think with on this question. When they talk about the history of this particular diagnosis and why it emerged when it did, one of the things that they suggest about it is that it had kind of broad social and political appeal as it was introduced. So for veterans and their clinician advocates, it provided a way to access healthcare and resources. And for an American public that had witnessed the war in Vietnam on TV and heard and seen accounts of American soldiers being involved in atrocities and terrible acts of violence in that war, it provided an explanation that made it possible for people to sort of condemn the war without having to condemn individual soldiers for their participation in it, because the toll of those acts on individuals could also be recognized. But Fassin and Reckman, the scholars who advance this argument, also point out that one of the things that happens here is that all of the kind of public ambivalence about the politics of that war and about macro-scale policy decisions about how violence was used and how soldiers and veterans were treated just becomes sort of swallowed up by this individualized clinical category, by a diagnosis that describes an individual set of symptoms and experiences that are ostensibly detached from politics. And that even as it is an incredibly valuable resource for people to be able to understand and make sense of their own experiences and gain access to healthcare and compensation, it also does this political work of understanding the major consequence of war to be a sort of depoliticized psychological condition rather than a set of moral and ethical questions that society as a whole potentially ought to grapple with.
Mm-hmm. I mean, do you see with some of the service people that you deal with some of the pressure that they should have PTSD? Like some people might come back from war okay, or...
I don't think we see people in a clinical setting, so it's a very small portion of the veteran population, so I just want to make that point as well. The picture that we see is more likely that the individual might be questioning whether what they've gone through is bad enough. So it's rating, if there's a sense of guilt for not having coped with something, because and it goes to that narrative about being the combatant and on the front line, if they haven't experienced that, or they know that people have and haven't. So there's a lot of comparison. So it's not so much that they expect to, but and again, from the clinical experience, it's more that there's guilt and shame around, I've developed these symptoms through what would very clearly, from a clinical perspective and an understanding of the neurobiology of trauma, be a traumatic experience. But I think for some, the understanding of what constitutes a traumatic experience is focused on the act or incident rather than the response. A trauma response is something that happens internally to an overwhelming situation, so that can be any sort of situation.
Mm-hmm. I think we might just open up the floor to a few questions. If possible, if you can keep your questions succinct and clear, and also if you can hold the microphone close to you so we can hear what you're saying. Back there.
Thank you. Dr. Ben's taken the first question I was going to ask about Agent Orange and how the government screwed that up with people. But the question I have to ask is comparison of war. And I think you've also talked about this one. When you look at World War II, when I was a kid, we used to go to movies to see heroes. You don't see that with Vietnam. I'm just wondering, to what effect does the general acceptance by the nation about the cause, or not the cause, but the acceptance of war compared to something like Vietnam, where it was hotly debated, and what impact that has on suicide rates?
I'd be happy to take at least a first crack at that. This might sound like sort of a non-answer. That's an empirical question. That's a question that we would want to investigate in order to be able to understand the role that narratives like that play in the way that people come to think about their service, their military experience, and their relationship to the stories they see and hear being told about it. Again, and I think, and actually both, I think we heard comments from the other panelists too that kind of speak to that question. So it's that's a particularity that I don't know that there's research that lends itself to, that there's existing research that lends itself to answering that. But I think we've heard a lot here about the kinds of questions that we would want to ask in order to investigate something like that.
Hello, panel. My name's Chris. I just wanted to ask the panel, what's your definition of a veteran?
Well, I don't know. There's institutional definitions, obviously. I think we've adopted the 1 day in the service as the current definition of a veteran for policy purposes. 1 day. 1 day in the service, yeah. And, there's debate, there is debate in the veteran community about that. Some people are very accepting of it and some people are quite resistant to it. I think if you've served, personally, I think if you've served, you've served. I think you've made the commitment, you've it's not often that someone does only serve one day. Maybe it's 5 weeks or 12 weeks or whatever. But you made the commitment, you've joined the institution, you've experienced at least some of that cultural transformation. So I think you develop an identity around that. Obviously, the longer you're in, the stronger you develop that identity. And I think that possibly the consequences are greater for veterans who have a much stronger investment in the veteran identity. But I can't see myself taking away the word, the definition of veteran from someone who has spent some time in the military.
This is for Megan or Ben. When you do research, or even when you type into Google veteran suicide, the reason that mainly comes about is PTSD. And that makes it very individualistic, pertaining to just the particular soldier who's the victim that by suicide. Is that a kind of a manner that the military could actually use to defend themselves, that their training is not one of the major factors that causes a soldier, whether deployed or not, into service for committing suicide or having that by suicide? What are your thoughts on that?
I do think that the individual diagnosis of PTSD, as others have mentioned, does individualize it for somebody and makes them sort of, from veterans I've spoken to, makes them conscious that their experience might be unique. And I think that there's this interesting paradox for the military, who's an institution that defines itself in terms of camaraderie, institutional support, talks about really works hard at creating this very particular image of itself, but there's this very clear signal that it's failing its service members consistently and regularly over a long period of time. And so I think that that's difficult for the Australian Defence Forces, the US military, to figure out how to address military suicide and other issues, sexual violence in the military, another systemic issue that signals institutional failure consistently over time. It's regular, it's predictable. And so I think pushing it to the individual can pathologize that person, but also take some responsibility off of the institution for failing its service members.
Yeah, I would echo that answer as well. I mean, your question makes me think of a comment from one of my close friends from the field work that I did at Fort Hood, who said to me that the military is very good at taking care of large groups of people, but when you get hurt or when you get sick, or if you are dealing with mental illness or psychological distress, you become an individual. You are no longer a member of a group. You're no longer a kind of interchangeable, disciplined body. And the military is not good at taking care of individuals. And this is something that actually it's possible to see reproduced in some of the military's own internal reports about behavioral health and the sort of management of the health of the force, that exactly as Megan just said, even as the military acknowledges that the demands that have been placed on its members are responsible for the manifestations of some really severe and often dangerous kinds of stress, there is also this sense that in order for the institution to function, these are the folks who either need to be made better or need to be removed from the institution in the interest of the institution's continued function. And if you read some of these reports, these are systems sort of telling us through their words what results they're interested in achieving. So.
Yeah, and if I might just say, I think that extends to the Department of Veterans Affairs. When military personnel move out of the ADF and then start transitioning through DVA. DVA have an illness model, and they want to characterise you as, in psychomedico legal terms, as someone with a pathology, and that permits the bureaucracy to be able to manage you. But I think the contrast to that is that military personnel, veterans don't see themselves as victims. Certainly, there's a challenge there about stoicism and, being self-reliant and being able to manage yourself. So that's very challenging, I think, once you move into DVA, to be able to work your head around that individualising as opposed to the cultural sort of impact of the organisation.
I guess it's the nature of academia that everything we're talking about is the past, and we're studying what's happened in the past and the situations that have occurred. What is, and if anything, is being done forward for prevention, getting new soldiers coming in ready to handle these kinds of things? I mean, obviously PTSD is a very individualistic issue, but we're now heading into a new realm of futuristic warfare, where we're talking about augmented reality and much more, psyops and everything are much more heavily being used in a lot of areas. Is there that looking forward in any way to prepare the military and their soldiers against all the new challenges that are coming?
Yeah, getting rid of soldiers, going to cyber, electronic, drone, artificial soldiers, I think, robots or whatever, it's a bit flippant, but that's one way of reducing those things, is taking people out of the equation.
But I also think, Ken, you've done some interesting work around resilience and how in the US military now they're sort of introducing programs where soldiers can actually sort of almost go to war and just do it and come back and everything's fine. It doesn't matter if they kill, it's this new resilience model, which I think is kind of, on some level, quite worrying, really. Like, if people go to war and come back and they're wounded by it, then that's okay. That's a normal human reaction.
Yeah, and one of the things that is being done is a series of efforts in the U.S. military, but also in Canada, in the U.K., and I believe there are programs that do this in Australia as well, that are oriented toward the cultivation of resilience in service members before they deploy, before they enter stressful circumstances, in the interest of making them better equipped to handle those circumstances when they emerge. This is a set of approaches that, for some people, is doubtless incredibly helpful and sustaining. It is also an approach that, one, in practice, is frequently administered in a kind of bureaucratic way. So in the case of the U.S. Army's program, a lot of the anecdotes I've heard about it and research that others have done about it describe these settings in which soldiers are basically sort of hustled through a bunch of PowerPoint online modules in which they learn about mindfulness or stress release activities, or how to count the 3 blessings in a challenging situation or something like that. Again, tools that for some people doubtless are useful, and that if deployed in the correct way could be incredibly helpful and sustaining. But given the mission-oriented nature of the military, and given the kind of exigent demands of deployment and things like that, becomes just sort of another, folks in my fieldwork would say, it's just another box to tick, or another kind of bureaucratic step to go through. But it does reflect that there is an interest on the part of the institution in trying to officially cultivate this idea of resiliency, that there is a technical solution to this kind of psychological, existential, or just human problem of what it means to be exposed to violence. But one last thing I'll say about it is also that one of the things that this accomplishes is that it reproduces the kind of focus on the individual, right? So if you can have a concern about a subject of PTSD is just someone who, who's a subject of individual psychological pathology or distress. So likewise, someone who is a subject of failed resiliency, that's also something that's kind of detached from the institution, or can have a kind of depoliticizing effect on how we think about that sort of distress. And I'm afraid, I apologize for the fact that that's not a particularly optimistic or hopeful answer. I'm sure we could also, I'm thinking of your comments too, I'm sure we could also, maybe have a bit of a conversation about what the things are that do work, or that help.
Actually, going to this idea of resilience and the way it's being kind of rolled out, like you can get a shot of resilience, and I don't think the evidence is really there to support that these resilience programs are sufficient. Whilst there may be some good tools and strategies, often it's people that would be deemed resilient can take advantage of those. And that, to your point, I think it then centres the problem within the individual. It's like, well, we gave you the resilience training, and if you still come out the other side with some sort of psychological distress, whether it be PTSD, depression, something else, I think that the danger is it's then again centering the problem and the pathology within the individual, and from a systemic point of view, I question its value. And I think there's particularly a lot of the research about resilience is often about connection to others and mentors and important people in life. So I think what is the focus is around preparation and how we prepare. I think an area we can actually really make a difference is how do we respond to people when they need help. And I think that's where I think you get great return for investment if that can be the way that we shape how we support people.
We've got a question just here.
Hi, I had a question with regards to the statistics and whether or not they distinguish between officers and non-commissioned members. So having walked on both sides of the line, being an officer and a non-commissioned member, the world is completely different for an officer than it is a non-commissioned member, right? So essentially the level of autonomy is completely different for an officer. The level of support that you get and the leeway you get with responsibility, of course, is a lot more. So have you found any distinction, and whether or not what qualifies an officer also qualifies somehow in the resiliency, to be less likely to maybe have death by suicide, or not really? Because in my experience in the Canadian Forces, by far it's been non-commissioned members that have been committing suicide, both in the military and outside the military as being released. So is there any data over there? Because I know you mentioned gender, and there's a lot more females in the officer corps than there are in the as non-commissioned members as well, and whether or not that has any sort of effect. Because I know, again, my own experience being over there, that it is still a boys' club on the officer side, even though there's maybe less of the control that you were mentioning, Ben. So did you see any difference? Is there data for that? Can you ask for data?
The data that I have seen, especially for the U.S., actually doesn't disaggregate between officer. At least I haven't spent a lot of time looking at the difference. I do know that there's significant cultural differences between officers, as you mentioned, and the enlisted. And certainly for women, I think some of the harassment and some of the strategies that officer women use to integrate and to fit in are very different for them versus enlisted. So enlisted women, we were just talking about this earlier, that some of the strategies women use to integrate might be a bit different. And also, the levels of acceptance are different within the officer versus enlisted. So I think you're absolutely right. There's a complete different experience and a different kind of vulnerability. I think officers that I've spoken to actually a lot of the 1st Infantry female officers. One of the things that they consistently experience is social isolation, because often they're the only females in their brigade. And so they don't want to come forward because they're already under scrutiny as the only women, and they don't have a lot of peers at their level. So I don't know how that contributes to vulnerability, but I think it's a very good point about the difference in culture.
I'm aware of some research looking at outcomes for people who have transitioned, and typically the poorer outcomes, and this is Canadian research, it's consistent I think with UK and Australia, they're fairly consistent. So being male, lower ranking, army, and an involuntary discharge, that may be medical or administrative, tend to have the poorer outcomes post-service. So they're fairly consistent kind of findings. And there's some interesting research in the Australian context around that officer or non-commissioned officer or other ranks looking at this model of languishing and flourishing, and there was a divide with officers tending to be flourishing versus other ranks languishing within that model. So there is some indication that that's the case. Yeah.
I think we're just going to take one more question up the back there, the lady.
So my name's Kerry Howard. I'm a psychologist and a trauma specialist. One of the things that's interesting, you've identified particularly around soldiers, but one of the things that I'm aware of in working with military personnel over time is that there's quite a lot of PTSD in Navy, actually, particularly around border force issues, and a lot of that stuff goes completely under-reviewed and not even made aware in the public domain. One of the things that I thought was really good about, Shane, you were identifying that PTSD precursors in terms of negative cognition and sense of self, there's a lot of things that sit outside of the military experience. I have prepared a PTSD prevention strategy. I'm actually going down to Phoenix, Australia next week. I've talked to Defence about the strategy, and it involves a number of different levels, but in essence, preventing the development of PTSD by intervening to relieve the underlying negative cognitions before they actually go out into a situation where they're exposed to recurrent trauma, and actually then intervening on a regular basis to manage the trauma. Same issue for defence personnel, also applies to emergency first responders, police, ambulance, spoken to Ambulance Victoria, Victoria Police. I think there are a number of things in terms of promotion, prevention, early intervention factors that we could actually be putting in place. The labelling, and I get everybody getting caught up about PTSD, human beings by our very nature all experience trauma on a recurrent basis throughout our lives. And if we could just understand that trauma is purely and simply a disconnection, and that what we need as human beings is connection, we can understand why traumatic experience recurs in multiple different situations. I think that it's really important that we identify that across our community, if we stop making trauma this big issue that somebody experiences when they have a really difficult situation, and recognise that it's something that we can pre-establish, understand if we've got some vulnerabilities towards, and actually take steps to reinforce and set up some resilience and intervention factors that we know work, and do them quickly within the first 6 hours of a particularly difficult situation. We can actually do a lot in regards to preventing PTSD developing.
Thanks for your comment. Megan, we need to wrap up now. Any other final comments from the panel?
Well, I think we're out of time for final comments, but I just want to say thank you very much. It's been such a pleasure and an honor to share the time with you, and thank you very much for being here and for your wonderful questions. So please join me in thanking our panelists.